of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. So, this book, you might say, is a big one, both because it is a sizable tome, but also due to the size of its influence. This is the book which pretty much the entirety of the fantasy genre exists in the shadow of, for good or ill. Now, I had read The Lord of the Rings many moons ago, but last year, on a whim, I decided to pick up this copy of it here and to give it a reread and see how I responded to The Lord of the Rings coming back after all these years. And I have to say that my reaction to reading The Lord of the Rings this time around was quite distinct to that of my initial reading of it. But as per usual, I intend to give you the lowdown on the book and my response to it. So, what is the story of The Lord of the Rings? I feel as though that is likely a rhetorical question. The book's fame is such that you out there are very probably aware already of the story that it tells, but I like to be thorough in these videos, and so for the sake of thoroughness, I will give an overview of the plot, even though it is probably entirely superfluous. But anyway, so taking place in a medieval style fantasy world named Middle Earth, The Lord of the Rings serves as a sequel to an earlier book by its author, J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit, although I don't think that it's strictly necessary that one read that book before reading The Lord of the Rings. But anyway, so taking place in a medieval style fantasy world called Middle Earth, populated with various fantasy races and creatures such as elves, but not of the Keebler variety, unfortunately, and dwarves and orcs and trolls, etc. The Lord of the Rings concerns Frodo Baggins, a hobbit, which is, in the world of the book, a race of little people with big hairy feet, who comes into possession of a magical ring, which is from the preceding book, The Hobbit, but a ring which just so happens to be the One Ring, forged by the Dark Lord Sauron in ages past, Sauron being a sinister supernatural figure who has arisen once again to once more attempt to take over the world and enslave all of Middle Earth to his will. So, after some deliberating, it is decided, due to the threat that this magical ring poses and the fact that it will be calamitous if it falls back into the hands of its owner, it is decided that the ring must be destroyed. But it can only be destroyed by being cast into the fires of Mount Doom, which is where it was forged, Mount Doom being a volcano. So eventually, Frodo sets out with a company, the Fellowship of the Ring, who are going along with him to aid him in his quest to destroy this ring. The company being composed of his trusty sidekick Sam, a fellow hobbit, and their friends Merry and Pippin, also hobbits, and their counselor Gandalf, a wizard, and then Aragorn, who is the heir in hiding to the throne of Gondor, Gondor being a major kingdom of Middle Earth, as well as Boromir, also a human, like Aragorn, who is the son of the current steward of Gondor, and then Legolas, an elf, but again, alas, not of the Keebler variety, and Gimli, a dwarf. And so they set out to go to Mordor, which is Sauron's realm, where Mount Doom is located, to throw this freaking ring in the fire and save the world. But after Boromir succumbs to temptation by the ring and attempts to take it from Frodo, the company breaks up. The Fellowship splits, and Frodo and Sam decide to go it alone into Mordor, while the rest of the company that remain go try to rally the peoples of Middle Earth to make a military stand against Sauron. There are various violent clashes. Concurrently with this, the plot line of the book from here on is kind of divided in two. Um, Concurrently with the mustering of the forces of uh, the free peoples of Middle Earth, Frodo and Sam meet up with Gollum, who is a both physically and mentally twisted former possessor of the ring, who is trying to get it back for himself. But he duplicitously agrees to guide them behind enemy lines, so to speak, into Mordor. And so it all comes to a climactic head as the armies of the free peoples of Middle Earth stand against the forces of Sauron from Mordor, um, in a kind of Armageddon style battle. And while Frodo, Sam, and Gollum eventually make it to Mount Doom, where after a tussle for the ring, Gollum reclaims his precious, but then falls into the lava, and the ring is destroyed. Sauron is overthrown, and Middle Earth is saved. And then there's kind of some falling action involving the defeat of a traitorous wizard who is another villainous character from the books. From the book, I mean, as Frodo and Sam and company fight to reclaim their homeland of the Shire, and then after that, that kind of protracted epilogue sequence, Frodo eventually sails away to the Undying Lands with the departing elves of Middle Earth as the Age of Men dawns. That's the plot of The Lord of the Rings insofar as I can give it briefly. Again, that was probably entirely unnecessary, but once again, I like to be thorough. So that's the story of The Lord of the Rings. Let's talk about the technical qualities of the story. So the writing in The Lord of the Rings is good. J.R.R. Tolkien was a very gifted writer. However, the nature of the writing in The Lord of the Rings is such that you might not be immediately struck by its skill. What I mean is, there are some books that you can pick up and open to any page at random and read, and it becomes immediately apparent uh, that this book is very finely written. The prose is such that it just kind of leaps out at you, and the beauty of it is on full display at just a cursory glance. The Lord of the Rings is not really like that. Rather, I it's kind of deceptively simple in terms of its writing, but yet there is an emergent elegance that becomes apparent after you're immersed in it for some time. Tolkien is not really one to use a bunch of like $10 words or really crazy sentence structures. It's all pretty straightforward in its delivery, and yet, as I said, there is kind of an emergent elegance that you begin to pick up on as you're reading this, and the elegance of this writing is very much reminiscent of like medieval romances, I think, as well as a slight scriptural quality as well. It's a book that feels archaic in the way it's written. It feels very much older than it is in terms of how the book is written, but it is quite well done. It really is. And I was struck more than a few times when reading it of just how elegant it really is. Tolkien was quite a gifted writer, and again, it may take getting into before that becomes really apparent, but it will become apparent, I think, if you read the book, that it is quite finely written. So no real complaints with the writing. I think The Lord of the Rings is a pretty roundly, fantastically written book. So on to the characters. Now the characters in The Lord of the Rings are a little stiff, I think, and that's kind of an issue that I remember having with the book, reading it the first time around. The characters in The Lord of the Rings are kind of archetypal in their depiction. Aragorn is the king, kind of the stereotypical noble king character. Gandalf is the wizened sage who provides sound advice to the characters on their journey. And that's not to say that the characters aren't dynamic and don't really change. Again, Boromir is like probably one of the more dynamic characters in terms of his actions in this. And yet, I couldn't help feeling still reading The Lord of the Rings this time that the characters are, they feel kind of at arm's length at times. Um, it's not that they um, are like bad, but I don't think there's quite as much depth as perhaps there could have been. That may just be me, but for me, the characters in here, it feels kind of distant at times in the way the characters are portrayed. Like maybe there's kind of some distance between the reader and the characters in terms of like their psychology. That may just be me, but I do think the characters are kind of at times at least on the stiffer side. But it's not such that it ruins the experience. And I will say that by the end, when we have um, the parting between Frodo and his friends at the end, when he sails away with the elves, that is incredibly poignant. It is a very poignant parting, I'll say. It does hit hard at times, um, but there were times as well in the book where I thought maybe it could have been a little bit more psychologically intensive than it was. But again, it's not bad enough to ruin the experience or anything. So the characters maybe could have been a little bit deeper, I think, but it gets the job done, I think. So now let's talk about like the story of this book, because The Lord of the Rings is, as with its writing, it's kind of deceptively simple. It is a very straightforward story. It moves in a very linear fashion. The goal is very clearly demarcated from the beginning, and yet there is more depth to it than you might first think. For one, it's kind of an inversion of the typical quest narrative, as the characters in the book are not going in search of a treasure, but rather they are going to destroy a treasure. Um, as well, it's also a book that I have to say is much deeper thematically than I gave it credit for the first time around that I read this book. And this brings me to how the book impacted me now reading it versus how it impacted me the first time I read it. So the first time I read Lord of the Rings, which I want to say I was like 17 or so, may have been 18, but I think I was 17 when I read The Lord of the Rings the first time. And while I did enjoy it, I mean, it's exciting. I mean, it's a grand epic adventure, and it will maintain your interest, I think. I didn't really regard it as like a truly great work of literature. I kind of dismissed it in a way, and that has to do largely with its morality, with the way that it depicts morality, and that also um, is reflective of how I have changed since then reading it now. So, um, when I read Lord of the Rings the first time, I kind of dismissed it as kind of childish in its outlook because it is so black and white in terms of its morality. It is so stark in the way that it portrays good and evil. But I suppose, as a wise man once said, "Unless you become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." And I think now I appreciated the book much more than I did the first time, because um, my moral outlook had changed so much from reading it then to reading it now. I feel sort of like Benjamin Button in a way. They say that when you're young, right, your moral outlook is very stark and simplistic. Good and evil are very clearly defined. And then as you age, those colors begin to run and things become gray. Well, for me, it's kind of the opposite. Again, I feel kind of like Benjamin Button in a certain respect, because I am a jaded millennial who grew up in a rather turbulent era in terms of international relations, where the leader of the free world is authorizing enhanced interrogation techniques and such. You know, good and evil in terms of like their portrayal on the news and, you know, what you've received in terms of like media reporting in the world and such. It can be kind of hard to find your bearings. You know, things seem rather gray. And like I say, you know, jaded millennial, I grew up with a much more cynical moral outlook. And when I read The Lord of the Rings at 17, I was like, this is like, again, childish in its outlook. But now, again, aging like Benjamin Button, my own moral outlook has sharpened dramatically to the point where now I truly do appreciate The Lord of the Rings fully for what it did and what it says in terms of its ethics. And I will say, for the record, that I do believe now that The Lord of the Rings is one of the most perceptive depictions, and also just one of the greatest depictions of the conflict between good and evil. You know, as T.S. Eliot said, that immortal battle between good and evil, I believe, is how he put it. The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, through The Lord of the Rings, I should say, uh, displays some very, very astute insights into the nature of good and evil. And uh, there were two things mainly that struck me when reading The Lord of the Rings, and that really made an impression upon me, and that is the necessity of always adhering to what is right, no matter how impractical that may seem. And that is, of course, why our world is, you know, the way it is, because we don't adhere to what is right. We do what is practical. And right and wrong are not utilitarian. I hope that if you haven't recognized that out there, that someday you will, that right and wrong are not tied to material benefit at all. Right and wrong are not utilitarian concepts, they are immutable uh, concepts that do not change. And the important thing that The Lord of the Rings impressed upon me is that if you hope to prevail against evil, you have to adhere to good, no matter how hopeless doing so may seem. Because the characters in The Lord of the Rings are presented with dilemmas at times where they have the choice between doing the right thing and then doing what you would call the practical thing. As an example, at the end of the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, in the beginning of the second book, The Two Towers, when the fellowship is split, Aragorn, who is the de facto leader now of the company, has to make the decision whether to go after Frodo and Sam, which I think most people would agree is the practical thing to do to try to help them, you know, accomplish their goal and destroying the ring and protect them, because they're just two little hobbits going off into basically Satan's domain, right? You know, what chance do they stand? Or they can go after Merry and Pippin, who have been, if you've read the books, you know, kidnapped by the band of orcs. And so we have the kind of divide between doing what's right and doing what is practical. And the characters choose to do what is right. Friends never leave friends behind. And so they go after Merry and Pippin, even though they're like, yeah, this might not be the smartest thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. And, you know, there's a line from Joseph Addison's play Cato that runs something like, "It is within the power of no man to command success, but will do better, will deserve it." And I couldn't help but be struck when reading The Lord of the Rings that the sentiments of J.R.R. Tolkien, as portrayed through the characters, kind of align with that. You have to be worthy of victory. You have to be worthy of goodness. If you hope to prevail against evil, you can't be evil yourself. You cannot forsake the good in the name of practicality. You have to adhere to what is right, and there is a right and a wrong choice to make in any scenario. Um, that is, again, the major distinction of between my reading of the book now versus my reading of the book then. I'm much more on the book's wavelength in terms of its moral outlook. But also, another thing which really, really struck me when reading The Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien's perspective on evil is that it is a self destructive force. And once again, I think that represents a very, very insightful observation on the part of the author, by recognizing that, because ultimately the way that the ring is destroyed by the end is due to its own corrupting influence. Um, Frodo, if you've read the books or seen the movies, I suppose, you'll know that Frodo eventually succumbs to temptation with the ring and ultimately claims it for his own. Literally at the last second, as he's about to drop it into the fire, it claims possession of him. And so he's like, the ring's mine. But then he gets tackled by Gollum and they fight. Um, and Gollum, who has already been perversely corrupted by the ring into a shadow of his former self, wrests it from Frodo and then falls into the lava and destroys himself in the ring. But the thing to be taken from this is that evil ultimately destroys itself. Evil is not a sustainable long term thing. It only can persist through the subjugation of goodness, and that evil, left to its own devices, will ultimately destroy itself. Good will prevail. You know, that's one of the most poignant scenes in The Lord of the Rings, is when Frodo and Sam are behind enemy lines in Mordor. They're starving and dehydrated, and you know there's little to no hope of ever coming back. But Sam looks up at the sky and sees a star, and he realizes that, as the book says, it's only a passing thing, this shadow, or something like that. The point being is that their evil won't win in the long run. Even if Sauron gets the ring, evil eventually will lose. Good always wins. And you know, that sounds like such a cliche, but cliches exist for a reason sometimes. And that is, again, my jaded 17-year-old self, my edgy 17-year-old self, when I read this book the first time, was, you know, liable to scoff at that. And I kind of did. I was like, this is like a very childish and simplistic perspective, which the book manifests. But now I appreciate that perspective so much more, because I'm much more on the wavelength of that. And I think that Tolkien's insights into the nature of good and evil are quite valuable and, again, quite on point. But The Lord of the Rings is also a very unique book, or at least was for the time, because it was so radically different from the prevailing literary mode or modes of the time. Uh, when The Lord of the Rings was published in the 1950s, European literature had really become uh, much, well, different than what The Lord of the Rings represents. You had books like Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway, modernist works, which were not only very, very stylistically different than this, because, not, you know, to say nothing of genre. The Lord of the Rings is, again, it's a very it's a very archaic feeling book in the way it's written. It's harkening back to much older works, whereas works such as Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway, and, you know, the more popular modes of writing at the time in Europe were much different than that. Generally more cynical, much less romantic, whereas The Lord of the Rings is much more classical, again, drawing from an older, more chivalric tradition. But though The Lord of the Rings may not have been on the cutting edge of literary stylistic experimentation, I, for one, would now nonetheless aver that it is worth more than many of those other more stylistically innovative, some people might say more literary works. due to its sheer purity and earnestness. And given that The Lord of the Rings is one of the most beloved books ever, I would say that a lot of people would be inclined to agree with me in that assessment. Heaven and earth may pass away, but the day will never come when The Lord of the Rings does not have the ability to speak to and perhaps even to succor the human spirit. So, with all that said, what would I rate The Lord of the Rings? I'm going to rate The Lord of the Rings an A. Perhaps not quite a perfect A plus, because again, I do think the characters perhaps could have been a little bit more detailed psychologically, perhaps. And also, there are parts in the book that are not described so much as related through secondhand exposition. I'm referring predominantly to like the Siege of Isengard. That entire event is just relayed secondhand, which kind of diminishes the suspense, I think, in certain parts. So, narratively, I do think there are points in the book that perhaps could have been handled a little bit differently, perhaps a little bit better. But on the whole, this is a masterful work. It is one of the great books. I think I can safely call it that. You know, I don't know if Harold Bloom included The Lord of the Rings in his Western canon, but I would in mine. I do think that The Lord of the Rings is one of the great books. It's probably, I would say, one of the 10 greatest books of the 20th century and probably one of the 100 greatest books ever, in my estimation, anyway. So, yeah, I'm giving The Lord of the Rings an A. Now, before I go, I would like to touch upon the films that have been based on The Lord of the Rings, because just as I and many others would probably consider The Lord of the Rings, the book, to be among the greatest ever written, so too would I and many others aver that the Lord of the Rings films are among the greatest ever filmed. So I would kind of like to just talk a bit about how they compare to the book, how they measure up, because as much as I love The Lord of the Rings now, as much as I can say that I truly cherish the book now, and is great and as influential as it is, I have to say that I think the films actually are a bit better. Now, hear me out, because I know that there are a lot of people out there sharpening their pitchforks and lighting up their torches already just by me saying that. But I truly do believe that the films tell the story of the Lord of the Rings a teensy bit better than the book does. Um, for one, just the way the films are structured, the way that the books that comprise the one big book that is The Lord of the Rings, that is the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King, the way that they're divided up and the way that they leave off is kind of awkward at times. I'll say that the way that the Fellowship of the Ring movie concludes is vastly superior to the way that the book, The Fellowship of the Ring, ends. There's more resolution there, and it doesn't just cut off so abruptly as it does in the book. But then again, with the Siege of Isengard, we see that in the movie, whereas in the book, it's just relayed secondhand. It's not even depicted directly. Again, I think that's a major improvement to do that. But also, the characters in the film are, I think, what the characters in the book needed to be. Like I said, the characters in the book aren't necessarily bad, but the characters in the film are much richer and have much more depth than they do in the book. Aragorn in the book is just the archetypal king. He's like, as soon as I get back on the throne, things are going to be great. I will reclaim my destiny as the king of Gondor. But as in the films, they make Aragorn be the kind of reluctant hero, and that gives him much more depth, I think. But it also allows us to kind of relate to him more. But see, the masterful thing about the films is that they managed to get the best of both worlds. They managed to retain the purity and the moral starkness of the book, and yet they still manage to give the characters greater psychological depth and detail. but they don't compromise. Like each of those things don't compromise the other. It's really walking a perfect tightrope, and it does it with great aplomb. I think across the board, the characters in the film are better than they are in the book. The character of Faramir in the film, I think, is so much superior to the Faramir of the book. He has such a beautiful arc in the film, and it culminates in that line, "Then it is forfeit," when he is willing to lay down his life to let Frodo and Sam go. I mean, that's not in the book. Again, the characters, I think, just across the board in the films are superior to their book counterparts. But beyond that, pretty much all of the things in the Lord of the Rings films that are just so stirring, so rousing, the things that make us love those films, you can bet on them not being in this book. What I mean is, um, the like at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring movie, whenever Gimli says, "Then it has all been in vain, the Fellowship has failed," and Aragorn gives that great line, "Not if we hold true to each other." That's not in the book. And then the Entmoot scene in the Two Towers, whenever Pippin says maybe we should just go home, and Merry gives that great little speech. The fires of Isengard will spread, and the woods of Tuckborough and Buckland will burn, and all that was once green and good in the world will be gone. There won't be a Shire. That's not in here. And then the relationship between Legolas and Gimli in the films is like one for the ages, of the gradual forging of friendship between two um, very, like, kind of racist characters. The elves and the dwarves do not like each other. But that's like barely in the book. And it's like it's there, but it's much more muted, and it's relayed much more through explicit exposition of Tolkien just kind of telling that, look, they're friends now, see, instead of it being shown. And then, of course, that great line, in The Return of the King, where Gimli says, "I never thought I would die fighting side by side with an elf." And, Legolas says, "What about side by side with a friend?" I can do that. Gets you, man. And that's not in here. And again, the biggest thing that was missing from the book that is in the movie is Sam's speech, right? The speech in the Two Towers about the great stories. And the folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't because they were holding on to something. What are we holding on to, Sam? That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. That's not freaking in this book, and it should have been, damn it. Again, I recognize that is a majorly unpopular thing to say, that the Lord of the Rings films are better than the book, but I will say that I love the book now. I can firmly say that this book is a masterpiece. It is justifiably one of the most cherished and beloved books ever written. It is also undeniably one of the most influential, and it deserves all the praise and adulation that it gets, that I have given it. But the films do the story more justice because they are more rousing, more inspiring, more stirring. And again, the characters are vastly richer in the films. It's just, I think the films perfected what the book did. Like, the book is great on its own because of it gave us the source material, but the films took that source material and they refined it, they perfected it. And I do think that the films actually do the story better justice than the book does. And though, again, I recognize that is a highly unpopular opinion, but you know what? I'll stand by it. I love the book, but I think the films do it just a teensy bit better. But anyway, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Have you read The Lord of the Rings? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. And if you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, of course I would recommend this. Like I said, this is one of the great books. This is uh, undeniably one of the most influential things ever written. But it is a modern classic. It will, the seas may boil and the stones may melt, but like, this book will endure, and it will endure justly because it is that great. Like, if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, do yourself a favor and consider doing so, because it is absolutely a book well worth reading. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.